Polls in recent years, and especially this year, show that a growing number of Hispanic voters, well, they're leaning towards supporting Republicans. And this seems to surprise a lot of pundits, especially those who believe that the so-called communities of color should be a natural constituency of the Democratic Party. Now, part of the challenge has to do with the definition of what it means to be Hispanic. When pollsters speak of demographics, it all sounds so very precise. But a book by Dr. Richard Alba called The Great Demographic Illusion explains the reality that racial and ethnic categories are very fluid. And when you try and talk about the Hispanic vote in election 2024, well, Dr. Alba has this to say.
The Hispanic population is so complex, it really is risky to make very strong generalizations or conclusions about it.
Now, one reason for all the confusion is the way the Census Bureau defines being Hispanic. They use a two-question approach. The first, do you have any Hispanic heritage? And then secondly, they ask about your race. Are you white, black, or Asian, or something else? So it's possible you could be white Hispanic or black Hispanic. And those categories begin to be a little bit blurry as you try and define them. Dr. Alba cited some research that when people are presented with Hispanic voters and asked to identify just visibly what their race or ethnicity is, well, half of them are identified as white. My own research shows that half of the people that the Census Bureau says are Hispanic don't see themselves that way. They tend to see themselves as either white or American or some other category. What ends up happening is this fluid nature of things affects day-to-day interactions. I gave this presentation to a group of political professionals at one point, and a woman in the audience texted a friend of hers and said, "How do you identify yourself, white or Hispanic?" And his response, "Depends who I'm talking to." Obviously an appropriate response, just trying to recognize that there are different dynamics of your daily life, some of which are tied to your heritage, most of which are not. Now, if that's not confusing enough, 13% of babies born in the United States these days have parents of mixed racial and ethnic heritage, perhaps an Hispanic woman and a white man. In that case, the Census Bureau would consider them to be Hispanic, but Dr. Alba says they tend to assimilate into mainstream culture.
I think the evidence shows clearly that they are in mixed environments in which whites are well represented.
Now, the reality is there's also some generational factors to consider. First-generation immigrants tend to identify with the home country, just as if we went to live somewhere else, we would do the same. Their children have a foot in both camps. By the time you get to the third generation, Hispanic voters whose both of their parents were born in the U.S., well, you know what? Their views are pretty much like all of their peers. They are part of that mainstream. They have the similar hopes and dreams for the life ahead of them. When we look at the polling data, the third generation Hispanic voters, well, they're kind of split between Republicans and Democrats, much different than parents and grandparents. So what does all this mean? Well, a big part of the shift towards Republicans among Hispanic voters is simply because many voters the Census Bureau defines as Hispanic don't see themselves that way. And even if they do consider themselves to be Hispanic, it's not always the dominant feature of their identity. Those are my thoughts for this week.